Chapter 8. The Americans' Part. Entering the Great War after it had already waged for nearly 3 years, the United States learned many of the lessons that experience had taught to the Allies and outlined a program that was designed to promote speed and efficiency. Every program that is dependent upon human action is, of course, imperfect. But the program of our country in this war has, at least, given to the citizens of our land opportunity for service in the prosecution of the war. No man, woman, or child in the nation need be idle or useless. He has the chance now of helping his country as he has had in no other time in her history. Why should the American help America? There is, to begin with, in the soul of every human being, a love of country that should come next to a love of God. Love of country is not only next to love of God, but is part of genuine love of God. No man who loves his God sincerely fails to love his country. Even those countries which have not been kind or just or fair to their peoples, countries where men are not given the chance for freedom or opportunity, have their patriots. But the United States of America, more than any other country in the world, has given to her people liberty, justice, opportunity, freedom. It is, therefore, the grateful duty of every American to do what he can to keep his country what she has been. For those men who are in the Army or Navy, the duty is clear. They are making the supreme sacrifice in standing ready to give their lives in the defense of our nation. For those who stay at home, the path may not be as plain, but it is there, and no one should fail to find it and travel upon it, for it is the road of patriotism, and patriotism is a divine duty. The United States, as we have seen, entered the war to uphold those principles of right which all great Americans, from Washington and Patrick Henry to Abraham Lincoln, have cherished. For freedom of the seas, for the safekeeping of the Monroe Doctrine, for the right of arbitration in international disputes, for the right of small nations to govern themselves, for the preservation of those free institutions of democracy which the autocracy of Germany strives to conquer, our nation took up the burden of conflict. While it is the first war in which we have sent our troops to foreign soil, it is a war in keeping with the basic principles of our nationality. It is being fought for the same freedom for which the 13 colonies fought in the War of the Revolution. It is being fought for the same maritime right for which the War of 1812 was fought. Both these struggles were, it is true, against England, who is now our co-belligerent in the war against Germany. By our winning of those wars, the United States helped the people of England to see that light for which they are now sacrificing everything. There were men in England, even in the times of the War of the Revolution and in the War of 1812, who believed America right, and who proclaimed their belief in the halls of Westminster. Their courage and our success set beacons on the hills of history for the lighting of those who followed. The same spirit that inspired our nation in its beginnings is the spirit that inspires not only ourselves, but those against whom we fought until they, too, are fighting for it now on the fields of Flanders and France. It is a war which is being fought for the same basic principles on which the War of the States was fought in the 60s of the last century. For while the North fought for the freedom of the slave, the South fought not for his continuation in bondage, but for the rights of the separate states. Both issues were fundamentally right. The greater, for the freedom of the individual, is greater than the constitutional right of a state, triumphed. But the spirit of both is American and part of our reason for entering this war. Since it is a war in keeping with American traditions, it is the part of the American, in service or out of it, to keep up the standard of our country in it. How shall he do it? Every man sees his own duty clearest, but there are certain lines of life in which this duty is so clear that it is easy to mark. One of these lines is that of the American of foreign birth or parentage, now a citizen of the United States. Another is that of the families of officers and soldiers. A third is that of the industrial workers of the country. The men, women, and children in any one of these zones have definite standards to uphold. If they fail to do so, they are not less traitorous than the sentry who falls asleep at his post and lets the enemy in. The American of foreign birth or parentage is a citizen of this country because he or his parents saw that America offered an opportunity which could not be secured in the old country. He is the recipient of favors of freedom, liberty, and such wealth as he did not before enjoy. His allegiance is doubly owed. It is therefore his part to do everything in his power to prove his gratitude. It is his part to combat all disloyalty, to uproot all treason, to stand firm for American principles at home and abroad, to proclaim by word and deed his loyalty to our country. Because this is a war for democracy, it is the part of every American to maintain that democracy at home, and in deed, as well as abroad, and in word. Military organizations have a tendency to create distinctions unless the people of the country keep close watch on themselves. Military discipline must be maintained, but any line drawn between officer and private must end with discipline and not be carried into private life. The private in the ranks is as great an American, if he does his duty, as the general in command, and no one knows it better than the general. It is not in the army or navy, but in the civilian families of soldiers and sailors that the danger lies. Therefore, it is the part of every member of these to bear in mind constantly and continuously that every man in the service is equal, that the commissioned officer is giving no more than the man in the ranks, and that both are giving up everything else in life for the one thing of paramount importance, the winning of the war. No snobbery is as good and as great an American watchword as "Give me liberty" or "Give me death," for snobbery is the death of liberty as surely as the will of a tyrant. The Junker class of Prussia is the officer class who look down upon all others and who have come to believe the world to have been made for their rule. We are fighting Junkerism in Europe. It is the American's part to fight the slightest trace of it at home. Every war has its home heroes as well as its field heroes. Since this war is, more than any other, a war of resources, it follows that the part of labor is more important than it has been in any previous war. If the working men and women of any one of the great warring nations should refuse to continue at work, that nation would be defeated as surely as if the armies had laid down their arms in the field. American victory is as dependent upon American labor as it is upon American manhood. And it is with pride that it may be said that American labor has been found worthy of all American traditions. The United States has been preeminently the nation of the working man. Its legislation has continuously tended toward the betterment of his condition. Nowhere else in the world has he enjoyed the lot that has been his in America. Nowhere else has he the voice, the power, the future that our nation accords him. And upon him in this war has fallen the duty of speeding up the war production of the country, a task so important that those men of draft age engaged in such occupations have been exempted from military service in order that they may continue at their work. For the making of munitions is as necessary as the firing of guns. It has become the duty of American labor to keep at the allotted tasks. No one must shirk, no one must fail, no one must delay. No matter how trivial the task may seem in the sum of the war work, it may be the one whose lack of doing may be the breach in the wall through which the enemy may enter. For the want of a nail, the shoe was lost. For the want of a shoe, the horse was lost. For the want of a horse, the rider was lost. For the want of the rider, the message was lost. For the want of the message, the battle was lost. For the loss of the battle, the kingdom was lost. All for the want of the nail of a shoe, and the maker of the horseshoe was one of the factors of his country's defeat. The civilians' part in this war has been outlined by the President of the United States in his proclamation of the 16th of April, 1917. These, then, are the things we must do and do well besides fighting, the things without which mere fighting would be fruitless. We must supply abundant food for ourselves, our armies, and our seamen, not only, but also for a large part of the nations with whom we have common cause, in whose support and by whose side we are fighting. We must supply ships by the hundreds out of our shipyards to carry to the other side of the sea, submarines or no submarines, what will every day be needed there, and abundant materials out of our fields and our mines and our factories, with which not only to cloak and equip our own forces on land and sea, but also to clothe and support our people for whom the gallant fellows under arms can no longer work. To help clothe and equip the armies with which we are cooperating in Europe, and to keep the looms and manufactories there in raw materials. Coal to keep the fires going in the ships at sea and in the furnaces of hundreds of factories across the sea, steel out of which to make arms and ammunition both here and there, rails for worn-out railways back of the fighting fronts, locomotives and rolling stock to take the places of those every day going to pieces, mules, horses, cattle for labor and for military service. Everything with which the people in England, France, Italy, and Russia have normally supplied themselves, but cannot now afford the men, the materials, or the machinery to make. America is the factory of the world. The American who stays at home is the worker in the factory, and it is his part to do his work so well that the man who fights overseas for the same cause may hold his hand in the essential brotherhood of equal service. Chapter 9. The United States and Individual Freedom. In the soul of every human being, no matter how clogged it be by traditions, lives the desire for freedom. It is this desire, this spark of fire, which has peopled the continent of America. For, long before the colonies revolted and established a republic, the great territory which has become the United States beckoned to the peoples of the Old World a welcome to a land which would give them opportunity for the freedom they sought. The whole history of the American colonies is a history of the search of mankind for individual freedom in which to work out his ideals without governmental interference. Political refugees, religious refugees dared the dangers of the ocean to come to the new land that they might live and worship as their souls urged them. The settlement of Massachusetts was made by the Puritans of England who were seeking a refuge from the oppression they had suffered in England on account of their religious beliefs and practices. They braved the stormy northern Atlantic to come to the wilderness. They braved the Indians to stay. They established their homes, their schools, their meeting houses, their government, and dwelt according to the dictates of their consciences in that freedom which they had desired. No less for freedom did William Penn and his colony of Quakers come to the Western Hemisphere. They sought a place where they would be given a chance to worship God according to their belief. A peaceful sect, they sought peace, and they brought into the new country standards of living that set their impress upon the infant nation. Liberal to others, as they desired liberality for themselves, they were destined to sow seeds of thought that were to be harvested in the effects of the Constitution of the Republic when it was formulated. The Huguenots in the Carolinas, fleeing religious persecution, found haven. Lord Baltimore established the Maryland colony of English Catholics who could not practice their religion in the old country. And, where the motive for the establishment of the colony was not in itself purely a question of finding a place of religious freedom, the interrelationship of the colonies became so close that in time the spirit of religious freedom became warp of the fabric of the country that was to be the American nation. Political freedom was promoted in the beginning by the distance of the colonies from Europe. France, Spain, and England were too far away, and ocean travel too hazardous to make the bond between the mother countries and the colonies tight. Men and women who had been venturesome enough to cross the seas were not of the sort who would be held for long by mere traditions of allegiance to old lands. Little by little, the people of the colonies gained larger measures of political freedom until the time arrived when the unjust tax imposed by England aroused them to revolt. The Boston Tea Party expressed the spirit of America. The Declaration of Independence voiced America's aspiration and America's intention. The War of the Revolution settled the right of Americans to their own government. The Constitution of the United States guaranteed to Americans their rights to the enjoyment of that freedom which had been the mainspring of the foundation of the nation. Gradually, the fact that this was a country where men could have a share in the government, could speak their minds, could worship God in their own way, could work out their ideals and ambitions without governmental interference as long as these in no way conflicted with the interests of law and order, went over the earth. It found its way into those countries of Europe where men were eager for its coming. The English, after the War of 1812, when the United States definitely established our standing as a nation, were among the first to come as settlers. And from other Western countries of Europe came other settlers, led by the knowledge that here could they enjoy individual freedom. To America, as to the Promised Land, flocked the Irish. Restless under the English yoke, denied economic, political, religious, and educational liberty by a government of an alien neighbor, the Irish people turned westward. The famine and the political revolution of 1848 sent them out from Ireland by the tens of thousands. To our land they brought a passionate yearning for freedom and a passionate gratitude to the country which opened it to them. And because they were, as a people, gifted with the power of expressing their emotions, they spread the fame of the United States broadcast over the world as a haven for those who sought liberty. After them came the Germans, led by the political refugees of that country who had incurred the enmity of Prussia in the Revolution of 1848, which had striven to bring some measure of freedom to the German people. Denied it at home, hundreds of thousands of Germans came to America to find liberty in their individual lives, to find opportunity. It is these Germans and their descendants who, understanding what the Prussian yoke means, have become among the best of our American citizens. Knowing what they escaped, they know what America fights against now. The third great movement of a people to the United States has been the westward coming of the Jews. In this country, as in no other, they possessed full religious freedom, and to this country they have flocked from every land of Europe where they had huddled unwelcome for centuries. Here they have found no opposition to their faith. Here they have had full chance to worship as they would. For the first time in thousands of years, the Jew could build his temple unhindered. For the first time since the Roman had gone into Palestine, the Jew was a citizen of the land in which he dwelt. Then came the peoples of Eastern Europe, peoples of the vast empire that is called Austria-Hungary for lack of a better name, ruled by a man not of their race, a man of one of the oldest, most corrupt and autocratic of the reigning families of Europe. They were struggling upward toward freedom when the growing commercial dominion of the United States took the word to them of our nation's beacon. To us, they have literally surged. Among us, they have found the freedom denied their peoples at home. Another people sought the United States to attain freedom. The Poles, oppressed on one side by Germany, on another by Austria, and on the third by the autocratic government of Russia under the Tsars, heard the tale of the land of liberty and set out for our shores in great hordes. So many have they come that Chicago is the second largest Polish city in the world, having almost as many Poles as Warsaw. And Milwaukee, Buffalo, and other American cities attest the surging of the Pole toward a land of liberty. In fact, there has been no country in Europe where people were dissatisfied with their government that has not sent its people to the United States. That France has sent the least number in proportion to her population has been due largely to the fact that the people of France had worked out for themselves a genuine democracy that satisfied the souls of her sons and daughters. Through the 141 years that had elapsed between the calling of the Continental Congress and the entrance of the United States into war against Germany, this nation had been solidifying that right of individual freedom guaranteed by the Constitution. The war between North and South had been fought in defense of the right of a human being to freedom as against the right of a state to separate itself from the national government. The latter issue was lost, not because it was wrong, but because it was not as vitally important in the history of civilization as the former. For that, men and women and children should be held in bondage violated the spirit of America, and the bondage had to be broken. No government, as Abraham Lincoln said, can exist half slave and half free. Someone has called America the melting pot of the nations. If it is, the fire that fuses the nationalities which have come to our land has been the fire of freedom. That is why America's entrance into the World War is so much more vitally significant than a mere attack in defense of certain violations of international law. It is a defense of the principle of individual freedom. Were the United States not to oppose a force that threatened the freedom of the world, we would not be worthy of the trust which the peoples of other lands have reposed in us. The Irish, the Germans, the Jews, the Slavs who came to America would eventually have come in vain. For Germany threatens the liberty of all peoples if she wins to victory in Europe. Germany stands for all those ideas of government from which these peoples fled. Germany stands for the suppression of the individual as a political unit. Germany stands for might. Against all that, we have always fought. If we failed to fight now, we would be but deferring the issue. And so, today, the United States sends our soldiers to France and our sailors out on the seas in defense of that right of mankind which is God's gift, no matter how men have tried to take it from him. The right of the freedom of the individual to live his life as he sees best, according only to the dictates of order, of moral integrity, of justice, and of righteousness. Chapter 10. The United States and International Peace. International, lasting peace is the third great ideal sought by the Republic of the United States of America, and it is for the enforcement of that kind of peace that the United States is fighting. For, unless such peace is assured by a decisive victory, the menace of German imperialism will so overshadow the world that all civilization will be flung back into one long effort to keep armed to repel the invader. Although other nations have struggled toward a standard of international and permanent peace, the United States was one of the first great nations to put the theory into practice. One of the first instances of this practice came at the close of the war between the states, when the question of the Alabama claims arose. During the war, the Confederate States had caused to be built in English ports, with the knowledge of the British government, cruisers to damage federal commerce on the high seas. The cruiser Alabama was most active of these, and from its prominence gave name to the claim which the United States brought against Great Britain for the offense against international law, particularly since the independence of the Confederate States had not been recognized. Great Britain had paid no attention to American remonstrance during the war, but at its close requested settlement of the difficulty. The United States was equipped for war, with a victorious army at command, and with a record of 2 victorious wars over England. It was a chance to launch another, had our nation been inclined toward militarism. Instead, our country did its part in appointing members of a joint high commission of 5 British and 5 American statesmen who met in Washington in 1871 and adjusted the difficulty. These commissioners made a treaty known as the Treaty of Washington, by which it was agreed that the claims of either nation against the other should be submitted to a board of arbitration to be appointed by friendly nations. In 1872, this board met at Geneva, Switzerland, and decided the claims in favor of the United States. Great Britain paid $15,500,000 for the damage done by the cruisers built in her ports. But even more important was the precedent established by two great nations. Through a period in which the world was singularly free from great wars, the peace ideal grew among those countries where the democratic form of government was progressing. The other nations, striving to maintain that elusive standard of political and trade domination known as the balance of power, juggled with the peace idea, but from a different point of view. And it was, strangely enough, the Tsar of Russia who proposed the establishment of an international court for the settling of international disputes. His idea, and that of the nations who accepted the plan, was to keep peace by a settlement of the causes of war, and also to reduce the military and naval armaments of the great powers. He also brought forward the idea that if war should come, the conditions of warfare should be made less terrible for the men who were fighting. He invited the delegates of the nations of the world to a conference at The Hague, in the Netherlands, in May 1899. The first conference promoted, to all appearances, a general good feeling, but did not formulate actual rules. The second, called by the Tsar in 1907 at the request of the government of the United States and extending from June to October of that year, promulgated certain rules that were regarded until the beginning of the war by Germany in 1914 as those which would hold all civilized nations. The articles of this conference, known as the Hague Conventions, provided for 1. The pacific settling of international disputes. 2. The recovery of debts contracted. 3. Rules for the opening of hostilities. 4. Laws and customs of war on land. 5. Rights and duties of neutral states and individuals in warfare on land. 6. Treatment of enemies' merchant ships at the opening of hostilities. 7. Transformation of merchant ships into war vessels. 8. Placing of submarine mines. 9. Bombardment of undefended towns by naval forces. 10. Adoption of humane standards authorized by the Geneva Convention to maritime warfare. 11. Restrictions on right of capture in maritime war. 12. Establishment of an international prize court. 13. Rights and duties of neutral states in maritime war. In addition to the adoption of these 13 articles, which were designed to keep peace, or to make war less terrible if it came, the conference established a permanent court of arbitration which has had its place at The Hague, and which is known as the Hague Tribunal. This court is really a number of judges from whom some are selected to try cases of international dispute. It is noteworthy that the first case laid before the Hague Tribunal for settlement was the Pious Fund matter between the United States and Mexico. The government of the United States took the dispute to The Hague, the first time in history when a great nation had appealed to an international court for settlement of a claim against a small nation. Since the Hague Conference, the United States has concluded about 30 peace treaties with as many nations. They are all modeled on one general idea, which is expressed in the opening article of each in this way: the high contracting parties agree that all disputes between them, of every nature whatsoever, shall, when diplomatic methods of adjustment have failed, be referred for investigation and report to a permanent international commission to be constituted by the contracting parties, and agree not to declare war nor to begin hostilities during such investigation and before the report be submitted. 35 nations had accepted this plan in principle before Germany flung war upon the world, and 30 treaties had been signed. France, Russia, Great Britain, and Italy had signed the treaties. Germany professed approval of the plan, but avoided all definite arrangements, her attitude apparently growing out of her dislike of arbitration. This opposition to arbitration on Germany's part was due to the fact that for many years she was actually preparing for war. and believed that her best chance of winning it was in the unpreparedness of the nations against which she intended to wage it. The utterances of her statesmen, philosophers, and editors revealed the German official attitude of mind. There can be no doubt but that Germany desired to keep the world lulled in a false security until she had made ready to strike the blow against world peace. Nothing else explains her refusal to bind herself with the terms that other nations accepted in the hope that wars were becoming things of the past. Just before the United States was forced into the breaking off of diplomatic relations with Germany, the President of the country went before the Senate to set forth the principles which should govern our nation in the making of any peace with which we would associate ourselves. The principles which he set forth were: 1. An equality of rights between nations, to be based on justice and not on the old principle of balance of power. 2. Recognition of the principle that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. 3. The right of all great peoples to have a direct outlet to the sea, either by territorial acquisition or by neutralization. 4. The freedom of the seas. 5. The limitations of armaments on land and sea. 6. Refusal to permit any nation to extend its policy over any other nation or people. 7. A concert of nations to guarantee peace and the rights of all nations, no entangling alliances creating a competition for power, but a league for the enforcement of international peace. These are American principles, American policies, the President stated. They are also the principles of forward-looking men and women everywhere, of every modern nation, and of every enlightened community. To the very last, until the action of Germany in restricting the freedom of the seas for which the United States had fought and won a war in days when she was ill-prepared for any conflict, our country had stood out for peace. Only when our vital rights were threatened, our vital principles violated, did war come. And when it came, the United States entered into the conflict, not in hot passion, but with the high purpose of establishing a real peace that cannot be broken by any one vandal nation. The kind of peace which is the ideal of the United States, and the one toward which we are now fighting, is not to be the sort which may be patched up over a council table for a brief space. There is only one way of curing a cancer of the human body. It must be cut out. And so it is with the world. The only way to cure the world of war is to cut out the cancer of militarism. The only way to cut it out is to defeat the armies of militarism. The United States and the Allies are not fighting to impose on Germany and her fellow fighters any particular form of government, but they are fighting to defeat that form of government which has precipitated the war, the so-called Junker policy of the German Empire. The Junker, who is a member of the Prussian nobility and a man devoted to militarism, has been the instrument of war, forcing it on the world that Germany, which for him means only a certain small class of rulers in Prussia headed by the Kaiser, shall be rich and powerful over all the earth. It is to end his reign upon earth that hundreds of thousands of men are dying on the fields of France and Flanders. It is to end that policy of Germany which aims to keep men always at war that we are warring. For if Germany is not totally defeated, every country in the world will have to build up a military machine of the same kind as Germany's in order to be ready to fight her when she makes up her mind to invade their territories. And no one will know when she might do that. The policy of Germany will threaten every democracy in the world, for democracies cannot exist while military establishments continue. Nothing but a total, annihilating defeat of Germany in this war will make the world safe for democracy and sure for peace. When the war is won, the United States will, it is sure, insist upon a just peace that will ensure these ideals, a peace that will make impossible another such outrage as the invasion of Belgium, another Lusitania outrage, another defiance of all civilized standards, a peace that will remove militarism, make free the seas, and give to the individual that freedom that has made the United States the haven of the whole world.